The 3rd of February 1971, Brooklyn, 778 Driggs Avenue. A plainclothes detective forces open the door of a 4th-floor apartment to make a drug arrest. He has done this dozens of times before. He goes in first. A gun is already pointed at his face. He is shot point blank, just below the eye. He falls in the doorway. Behind him, in the hallway, 2 fellow police officers do not move. No radio call goes out. No 10 to 13 officer down. Nothing. He survives only because an elderly woman in the building hears the gunshot and calls the police herself. His name is Frank Serpico. 9 months later, he will testify in front of television cameras and dismantle the New York Police Department's official version of itself. 51 years after that gunshot, the NYPD will finally, formally admit what happened to him that night. In the late 1960s, corruption inside the NYPD was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a system. Plainclothes officers in vice and narcotics units collected regular cash payments known internally as the pad from bookmakers, drug dealers, and brothel operators, who paid simply to be left alone. The money was collected on a fixed schedule and divided among officers in a unit, whether they had asked for a share or not. Refusing the money was not treated as integrity. It was treated as a threat. An officer who wouldn't take a cut was an officer who might talk. And in a unit where your life depends on your partner following you through a door, that suspicion was itself a form of danger. Frank Serpico joined the NYPD in 1959. By the mid-1960s, working plainclothes in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan, he had refused the pad more times than anyone around him could remember. His colleagues assumed he was either an informant or unstable. Either conclusion meant the same thing in practice. He would be frozen out. No one would back him up if it mattered. It would matter. Francesco Vincent Serpico was born on the 14th of April, 1936, in Brooklyn, the youngest son of an Italian immigrant family who ran a small shoemaker's shop. As a boy, he idolized the police officers who patrolled his neighborhood. He wanted nothing else. At 18, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and served 2 years in Korea. He came home, worked part-time, took night classes in police science at City College, and joined the NYPD in 1959 at the age of 23. He made patrolman, then moved into plainclothes investigative work, the unit where the pad operated most openly. He later said that what he wanted was simple: to do the job he had dreamed of as a boy without becoming what he saw around him. He calls people like himself lamplighters rather than whistleblowers, a term he borrowed from Paul Revere's Ride, because lighting a lamp to warn people is not betrayal, it is illumination. Nobody around him saw it that way at the time. Here is what most people assume about the Frank Serpico story. A corrupt institution was exposed, a commission was formed, reforms followed, and the man responsible was honored for his courage. A clean ending. The system eventually did the right thing. But here's what actually happened after the cameras turned off. In 1972, Serpico was awarded the NYPD Medal of Honor, the department's highest commendation for being shot in the line of duty. It was handed to him across a countertop. No ceremony photographs. The certificate that should have accompanied it was never issued. The medal itself was inscribed with the wrong rank. He left the NYPD soon after and spent the next decade living in Europe, not as a retirement choice, because he did not feel safe in New York. He did not receive a correct, formally inscribed Medal of Honor certificate, the one actually earned the night he was shot, until the 4th of February 2022. 51 years after the gunshot, it arrived by mail. If you're finding this story as difficult to believe as I did, hit subscribe. We cover the stories that were buried, classified, or deliberately forgotten. New file every week. Now back to the story. The system Serpico refused to participate in was not hidden. It was understood, almost administrative in its regularity. Bookmakers paid a fixed amount per month to the plainclothes units operating in their territory. Drug dealers paid to be tipped off before raids, or to have evidence quietly lost. The money moved up through informal hierarchies inside precincts, distributed according to rank and seniority. New officers were brought in and given their share before they had even asked for it, a deliberate practice, because an officer who had already taken money had no clean position from which to report anyone else. Serpico refused. Repeatedly, consistently, for years. He won departmental commendations for solid investigative work during this period, but each commendation made him a more uncomfortable presence to the colleagues whose money he kept declining. Through the mid-1960s, he tried to report what he was seeing through internal channels. He spoke to his commanding officers. He partnered with another officer who shared his concerns, David Dirk. Together, they brought their evidence to John Walsh, the NYPD's Chief of Inspectional Services. Nothing happened. The reports were absorbed and went nowhere. Captain Philip Foran, one of the officials who blocked Serpico's reports from advancing, responded to the accusations not by investigating them, but by attacking Serpico personally, calling him unstable and questioning his character in terms designed to discredit rather than address what he had reported. By 1970, after years of being ignored internally, Serpico and Dirk went outside the department entirely. On the 25th of April, 1970, the New York Times published a front-page investigation based substantially on Serpico's evidence. The headline read, "Graft paid to police here said to run into millions." The article, written by reporter David Burnham, did not soften its conclusions. It directly implicated the mayor's office and senior police officials for years of inaction despite credible, specific evidence of systemic corruption. The public reaction was immediate and significant enough that Mayor John V. Lindsay could not ignore it. Within weeks, he appointed a 5-member panel to investigate. It would become known as the Knapp Commission after its chairman, federal judge Whitman Knapp, a man specifically selected because he had no political relationship with City Hall. The commission spent more than a year taking private testimony before opening public hearings on the 18th of October, 1971. 9 months before those hearings began, Frank Serpico would be shot in the face. On the evening of the 3rd of February 1971, Serpico and 2 backup officers, Gary Roteman and Arthur Cesare, arrived at 778 Driggs Avenue to execute a narcotics arrest. Serpico went up first, alone, to the apartment door. This was not unusual procedure for the kind of buy and bust operation they were running. What was unusual was what happened once he reached it. He forced the door open. The dealer inside already had a gun raised. He fired immediately, point blank, into Serpico's face, the bullet entering just below his eye. Serpico returned fire and wounded the gunman before collapsing in the doorway. Roteman and Cesare, his own backup, positioned in the hallway specifically to support him in exactly this situation, did not enter the apartment. No 10 to 13 call went out over police radio. That call officer down requesting immediate assistance is the most basic obligation of backup in any police department in the country. It did not happen. Serpico has said in interviews, repeatedly, across 5 decades, that he believes the failure to call it in was not panic and not hesitation. He believes it was deliberate. He survived because a woman living in the building heard the gunshot through her door and called the police herself. On the morning of the 14th of December 1971, Frank Serpico put on the only suit he owned and stopped to have his shoes shined before heading to the Knapp Commission hearings. He was 35 years old. He had a bullet fragment still lodged near his brain, permanent hearing loss in his left ear, and chronic pain that would eventually force him onto a disability pension. He has survived death threats in the months since the shooting. He had been told by colleagues openly that what had happened to him was simply how the department worked. He testified for 3 hours in front of television cameras, describing in granular detail the mechanics of the pad names, amounts, locations, the specific officials who had buried his reports for years. He returned in December for a second appearance. A line from that testimony is still quoted over 50 years later. The atmosphere does not yet exist in which an honest police officer can act without fear of ridicule or reprisal from fellow officers. The Knapp Commission's final report concluded that corruption inside the NYPD was not the work of a few bad individuals. It existed at every level of the department, systematically, including direct police involvement in the city's illegal drug trade. In the months following the report's release, the New York Times reported that at least 40 officers were indicted. Serpico had done exactly what the system claimed it wanted from honest officers. He had reported corruption through every available channel before finally going to the press. He had testified publicly, on camera, at enormous personal risk, with a bullet fragment still in his skull. The department's response was not gratitude. After receiving his uncelebrated Medal of Honor across a precinct countertop, Serpico resigned from the NYPD. He spent the next decade living in Europe. He has described this period not as travel, but as recovery physically from the wound and from the specific psychological toll of having been a target inside the institution he had served. He did not feel safe returning to New York. The men who controlled the pad and the men who had let him bleed in a hallway were still on the force. When he eventually returned to the United States in the early 1980s, he settled in rural upstate New York rather than the city. He continued speaking publicly about police accountability for decades, including raising concerns about the attempted cover-up following the 1,999 shooting of Amadou Diallo, an unarmed man killed by NYPD officers in a hail of 41 bullets. In a 2010 interview, he said simply, "I hear from police officers all the time. They contact me." He had become, in the decades since the Knapp Commission, the reference point that other officers reached for when they were facing the same choice he had faced, and the same isolation that came with it. Peter Maas's 1973 biography and the Al Pacino film of the same year made Serpico, a word shorthand, recognized globally for an honest insider who exposes corruption from within their own institution. Serpico has said that even decades later, certain scenes from the film are difficult for him to watch because of how closely they reproduce what actually happened to him that night in the Driggs Avenue hallway. What the film and the legend obscure slightly is the specific institutional pattern that followed the heroism, not punishment, not retaliation in any dramatic sense, but 51 years of administrative neglect, a medal handed across a counter, a missing certificate, an incorrect inscription, no formal correction issued for half a century, despite Serpico raising the issue repeatedly and publicly. This is not a story about one corrupt department in one decade. The pattern Serpico exposed in formal payment systems, institutional protection of wrongdoing, retaliation against those who report it has reappeared in police corruption scandals across the United States in every decade since the Knapp Commission concluded its work. Peter Gleason, an attorney who later helped Serpico secure his proper medal, said it plainly. If people had taken heed of what Serpico exposed in 1971, numerous corruption scandals in the decades since might never have happened. The NYPD, he said, created the situation. It never properly investigated why. In December 2021, on the 50th anniversary of his Knapp Commission testimony, Frank Serpico posted a message on social media. He said he was still waiting for the NYPD to issue him an authenticated Medal of Honor certificate and a properly inscribed medal. He said he would simply request it himself, publicly, since no one inside the department ever had. Mayor-elect Eric Adams responded within hours and promised to correct it. On the 4th of February 2022, 51 years and 1 day after the bullet entered his face, the certificate arrived at Serpico's door in a plain package. He posted a short video of himself opening it. For the 21-gun salute traditionally given to honor an officer's valor, he used the only sound available to him at his kitchen table. He popped a sheet of bubble wrap. If this changed how you see the institutions built to protect honesty, share it with someone who thinks doing the right thing is always rewarded. Subscribe for the next file. It drops next week.